It's week 7 and you want a winning lineup, but you're not sure who to start at tight end. Well, good news. SI's fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano is here to break down the playmakers that can make all the difference in winning or losing your matchup. Babs, who are the tight ends fantasy managers want to start this week?
Boy, this position has become very thin, Kaitlin. But if you drafted TJ Hawkinson, I think you're pretty happy. Last week, he was my start of the week at tight end, got into the end zone against Jacksonville. Now he's got Atlanta. This defense has allowed a league high 7 touchdowns and the second most fantasy points to tight ends. So Hawkinson is a great spot to succeed. This should be a high scoring game. He is a top 10 play at the position. And then let's move on to Austin Hooper, who admittedly I haven't been big on this season. But look at the numbers. Over the last 3 weeks, he's sixth in fantasy points among tight ends. He ranks third behind George Kittle and Travis Kelce in targets. That's pretty good company. And so he's seeing increased volume. He's got a good matchup this week against Cincinnati. Their defense has allowed the sixth most fantasy points to tight ends, and 5 different players of position have scored at least 9.9 fantasy points against them. So get Hooper in your lineup this week.
Yeah, as mentioned, he's getting increased volume. We're seeing him getting more and more involved in the Browns offense. Plus, I don't know, I think the Bengals are going to focus on covering OBJ and Landry, so maybe he gets even more targets this week. But Fabs, who are the tight ends who should remain on your bench this week?
Do you remember how good Tyler Higbee was in the second half of last year? Like every week he was putting up huge numbers. He was great. This year, yeah, not so much. And he actually led the Rams in receiving last week, but he had 56 yards and Jared Goff was terrible. He's sharing more of the workload with Jared Everett, who has more targets than Higbee over the last couple of weeks. And then you put the matchup in there as well against Chicago. This is a very bad game for both Tyler Higbee and Gerald Everett. The Bears have allowed an average of 48 yards per game to the position. Only 2 tight ends have scored double-digit fantasy points, so Higbee needs to be on your bench. And then Jared Cook. Now, before the bye, he had a pretty good stat line, had a touchdown. The targets weren't that plentiful, but he still had nice numbers. But I feel like it is difficult to start him this week against Carolina. Their defense has only allowed 2 touchdowns and 10.5 fantasy points per game to tight ends. And also keep this in mind. This team held Jimmy Graham, Hayden Hurst, and Rob Gronkowski all under 9 fantasy points this season. Couple that with the fact that Drew Brees ranks 27th among qualified quarterbacks in targeting tight ends. And well, Jared Cook is a risk for me against Carolina.
Yeah, that is not something that I would want to mess with. Fabs, thank you. Great stats, great insight as always. Appreciate you. And for you guys at home, for more advice and Sports Illustrated's award winning weekly player rankings, get your membership to SI Fantasy Plus for just $14.99 a month.